Hello, welcome. Good afternoon to everybody who's already here. I'm very happy to be hosting our fourth life sciences session already for you since we started in November last year. This session will discuss, as you will all know, regulatory exclusivity rights for pharmaceutical products. It's a broad topic. There are a lot of things to discuss, so we wanted to dive into the topic immediately and not lose too much time. I will be discussing the topic together with Laura Traest, who's one of our associates at Altius, one of, I can honestly say, a very dedicated and invaluable member of our life sciences IP team, who's also has had international recognition recently when she won the Young Uplaw mock trial, so a mock trial for young European patent lawyers below the age of 36. And so it's actually my honor to be sharing the stage with her. On the agenda will be, and I need a pointer, on the agenda for today will be the following topics. Laura will first of all provide you with an overview of regulatory exclusivity rights. She will guide you through the maze of what is, I think, a fairly complex system, a number of regulatory exclusivity rights existing next to one another. She will also be discussing the SPC Manufacturing waivers, so the manufacturing waiver for supplementary protection certificates in particular. And after that, I will take over again and join you again discussing SPCs and the CGU, what has happened in the past year at the level of the CGU, the Court of Justice of the European Union, in respect of supplementary protection certificates. I will also be discussing the European Commission's review of regulatory exclusivity rights, and in particular orphan exclusivity and pediatric rewards. And finally, if time allows, I will be shortly giving you an overview of what has been discussed and decided in the General Court's Polpharma ruling of earlier this month. So without further ado, I hand you the floor, Laura.
Thank you, Kirian. Thank you for that very kind introduction. As Kirian said, we have a lot to discuss today. We will be starting with the overview of exclusivity rights that are available within the EU. We will be discussing this in two categories. We will first turn to what general exclusivity rights are available, meaning general, i.e. for all medicines. Our second category is somewhat different in the sense that it concerns exclusivity rights that are available for specific populations. This will be orphan exclusivity, which are medicines for a small population of people suffering from a rare disease, and also pediatric rewards, which are intended for children. So turning to this first category of general IP regulatory exclusivity rights, we have first and foremost the patent. The patent gives the patentee an exclusive right to an invention, which lasts for 20 years, starting from the filing date of the patent. So in normal circumstances, that means that a patentee can immediately start commercializing his or her product after the patent is filed. However, that is not the case for pharmaceutical patents, which require that the product that is commercialized under the patent, the medicinal product, is first authorized for use in the EU. That authorization, that regulatory approval, is granted in the form of a marketing authorization, an MA. And this marketing authorization requires that the product is safe to use in patients and that it is also efficient for the indication that it is meant to solve. And so in seeking that regulatory approval, you have to show these various safety points, and this entails that you must show that you have done clinical and preclinical trials to that end. Now, if you have run through that whole MA application process, you will often see that you have spent years doing so, meaning that you have effectively lost several years of patent protection. Now, the EU legislator has acknowledged this issue and has created the so-called SPC, or Supplementary Protection Certificate. The the supplementary protection certificate is meant to compensate for that loss of time that you have been busy seeking regulatory approval in the form of an MA. And so what the SPC really intends to do is sort of compensate or restore the patent term that was lost. It does so by extending the patent right, specifically for the product that is under the marketing authorization. So an SPC will always be based on, first, the patent, which you have lost your patent term in, and also the product under the marketing authorization. The SPC will last for a maximum of 5 years, and there are essentially 3 rules of thumb in calculating your SPC duration. The first is that, of course, the principal and SPC should last for the time that you have lost, minus 5 years. The SPC itself cannot exceed 5 years itself, and the combined patent and SPC protection after the marketing authorization should not exceed 50 years, which means, as a consequence, that if your marketing authorization is granted less than 5 years after your patent filing date, which means that you have lost less than 5 years seeking regulatory approval, there will be no SPC available. If, however, you have lost, for example, 11 years seeking regulatory approval, there will be an SPC available for the maximum duration of 5 years. Then turning to our first truly general regulatory exclusivity right, we have the mechanism of regulatory data protection and market protection. This is a sort of mechanism that kicks in after that marketing authorization is granted. So first of all, as I told you, you have to show safety and efficacy, amongst other things, to obtain that marketing authorization. You will be showing that through clinical and preclinical trials. Those represent a substantial financial investment. And so the regulatory data protection was essentially created to protect that investment for a duration of 8 years. So what does it mean? It means that the data that you have submitted to the regulatory agency in order to get your marketing authorization will be protected in the sense that a generic or a biosimilar or a hybrid company cannot cross-refer to those data when it intends to apply for its own marketing authorization. And so there is the data exclusivity for 8 years after the grant of your marketing authorization. However, when those 8 years come to expire, you have an additional 2 years of market protection. And this means that even though those 8 years of regulatory data protection have expired, and the generic or biosimilar or hybrid can now cross-reference those data in the originator filing, it can still not come on the market. It must wait 2 years before putting a product on the market. Then this brings us to 8 plus 2 years of essentially market exclusivity. Now, these 2 years can be extended to 3 years if you can show, if you have obtained a new marketing authorization for a new indication that represents a significant clinical benefit. And so if that is the case, you will have essentially 11 years of market exclusivity. Do note that there is also a separate year of regulatory data protection in case you are able to obtain a marketing authorization for a new indication for a well-established substance, or if there are clinical data that that lead to a classification change. A classification change means that it concerns the question whether or not a product is subject to a prescription. And so if we're trying to represent this visually, we could, for example, have obtained a marketing authorization in 2008, and then, of course, have those 8 years of regulatory data protection. After those 8 years, a generic marketing application can be introduced because those data can be cross-referenced, and an additional 2 years of market protection will bring you until 2018. If, however, you have obtained a second marketing authorization for a new therapeutic indication, which represents a significant clinical benefit, then you will be able to have an additional year of market protection until 2019. And this means that from a regulatory perspective, a generic or biosimilar or hybrid launch could be possible as of 2019. Then turning to our specific populations, which I told you was the Orphan Exclusivity and the Pediatric Rewards. We will be first looking at orphan medicines, which are essentially medicines for rare conditions. So it either goes towards there being only a small population of people suffering from that disease, which is the first condition, and there being no satisfactory method within the EU, there essentially being no satisfactory alternative, or if there is, that medicinal product that is seeking orphan designation will still be of significant benefit. Now, these two conditions must be met both at the moment you are seeking your orphan medicine designation and also at the moment you are seeking the market authorization. Now, what does it actually bring you, the designation as an orphan medicine? Well, it grants you a 10-year market exclusivity for the same indication in a similar medicinal product. Now, I told you when we were discussing the general market protection period that this was vis-a-vis generic and biosimilar and hybrids, which are, for all intents and purposes, considered to be identical to the originator product. However, here, it doesn't have to concern a identical medicinal product because a similar product suffices. Now, the meaning of similar is, in a sense, somewhat broader in the sense that it can concern an identical active substance, which means that it is an identical medicinal product, or it can concern an active substance with the same principal molecular structural features acting through the same mechanism. So it is a broader exclusivity, it has a broader scope than the market protection that we've just seen. It is important to note, however, that this 10-year period can be reduced to 6 years if it turns out after 5 years that there is, in fact, that one of those two conditions that I've shown on the first slide, the previous slide, are no longer met. If it, for example, turns out that the product is sufficiently profitable, then that can be reduced to 6 years. Moving on to pediatric rewards, which are, of course, rewards that are generated for medicines that are specifically used in children. Pediatric rewards are, in fact, a reward that is given to marketing authorization applicants because of an extra obligation that they have to comply with. If you are seeking a new marketing authorization, or even if you want to add a new indication or a new pharmaceutical form to an existing marketing authorization, you have to submit a pre-approved pediatric investigation plan, or PIP. Those contain studies in children that will have to be carried out. And once you are applying for that marketing authorization, you have to show that you have complied with the PIP. And so if you can show that you have, you will be eligible for pediatric rewards. You can either, best case scenario is that you have carried out these studies and that you have found a useful new indication in children, which means that you can have a new marketing authorization for a pediatric indication. If that is, however, sadly not the case, and you have not, or these studies have not given you so-called positive results, you can still have the pediatric rewards, but you must include those results in your summary of product characteristics. Now, what are the actual rewards that you can get in that case? They're actually threefold. Two of them are sort of an add-on or an extension to the existing regulatory rights, which we've just seen, and one is actually one of its kind. We will come to that. So the first reward, which is a sort of add-on of extension, is the 6-month SPC extension. So as I've told you before, an SPC is available in certain cases, and if you have such an SPC and you have not used the additional year of market protection, you are eligible for a 6-month SPC extension in the form of a pediatric extension. If, however, you have an orphan medicine, and then you will be eligible for a 2-year extension on your 10-year market protection term, bringing you to 12 years. And so I told you also that there was a reward that was its own kind, and that is the Puma, the so-called pediatric use marketing authorization. So if you have a medicine that is already authorized and that is no longer protected by an SPC or a patent, and you find that there is a specific therapeutic indication for children, you will be eligible for a Puma or a PUMA. So it is important to note that this is only available for an off-patent medicine and exclusively covering a therapeutic indication in children. And so if that is the case, if you have this PUMA, you will be eligible for 8 + 2 years of regulatory data protection and market protection along the same lines of the general exclusivity right that we've seen about 5 minutes ago. And so again, if we try to represent this visually, we will first turn to this SPC extension. So if we have a patent filing in 1997, we have a 20-year protection term on our patent, bringing us to 2017. However, we have obtained our marketing authorization in 2008, meaning we have lost 11 years of patent protection. This essentially means that we will be eligible for the maximum duration of 5 years for our SPC, bringing us to 2022. Now, as the regulatory data protection and the market protection kicks in, we have a generic marketing application or biosimilar or hybrid marketing application that is possible as of 2016, because as you know, the regulatory data is protected for 8 years, after which a generic that does not wish to carry out its own studies can cross-reference to the studies in the originator filing. However, we have obtained a second marketing authorization specifically for a pediatric indication. This means that there will be a 6-month SPC extension, bringing us to June of 2022. Now, another example, now combining orphan medicines and pediatrics. Our initial MA is therefore an orphan indication. We have a 10-year exclusivity period, which brings us to 2018. Our second marketing authorization, again, a pediatric indication in 2012, having those additional 2 years of pediatric extension to our market exclusivity brings us to 2020. And then another example, this time for PUMA or Puma, again, patent filing 1997, patent term expires in 2017. Marketing authorization first marketing authorization granted. It's an orphan indication. The patent expires in 2022, and then in 2027, for example, this known medicine, because it's been under an MA before, has a new therapeutic indication, which is exclusively in children, and so this would trigger the Puma. For 8 + 2 years of regulatory data protection and market protection. And that brings me to the end of my overview of the exclusive rights that are available. Now turning to the SPC manufacturing waiver, actually zooming in on that SPC and how the scope of what is considered an SPC infringement might somewhat differ. Because there is SPC manufacturing waiver found in Article 5 of the SPC regulation. This is the SPC regulation specifically for medicinal products because this manufacturing waiver does not apply to SPCs for plant protection products. Now, the objective of the EU legislator was to create a waiver for, or create really a level playing field for manufacturers of generic and biosimilar products that are established in the EU and that wish to manufacture products that are normally under SPC protection in the EU, but if it's just for export to third countries, that was, before the SPC manufacturing waiver, impossible because it would constitute a SPC infringement. The same is true for those manufacturers that want to start production in order to be ready for day one entry, meaning that they can come on the market as soon as the SPC in Europe expires. And so this was, for all intents and purposes, forbidden within the EU, and this has now been changed by introducing a manufacturing waiver, a sort of exception where manufacturing for certain purposes is now no longer considered to be an SPC infringement. It concerns manufacturing of those SPC protected active ingredients or the corresponding medicines, either for export to third countries, which is a waiver that lasts throughout the entire lifetime of the SPC, or if it is for storage in order to be ready for that day one entry, then that can only happen during the last 6 months. Related acts that are strictly necessary for these purposes are also waived. However, that scope of this waiver does not extend to importing such ingredients in order to go and repackage them, re-export them, or store them. There are certain safeguards in order to guarantee that the rights of the SPC holders within the EU are safeguarded. Those obligations rest upon the so-called maker, which is essentially the person that on whose behalf these waived acts will take place in the EU. And so there are essentially 3 obligations for his maker. First, he has to notify both the SPC holder and the competent authority, which is the Dienst Intellectuele Eigendom, or the Belgian Intellectual Property Office, of his intentions and of certain pieces of information, such as his name and address. He must do so at least 3 months before the so-called making will start, or the first related act, whichever comes first. Secondly, if he intends to export these products, he must affix the logo that you see on the slide to these products in order to make sure that once they are exported, they are not re-entering the EU at a later stage. Third and final obligation he must comply with is an information obligation towards his own contract parties. So the parties that will be actually doing these waived acts on his behalf. He must tell them that, first of all, that these acts are under the waiver, but secondly, that still placing on the market or importing, re-importing such products could infringe the SPC where and if it applies. And then my final point on this is the transitional regime, because this waiver does not apply to all SPCs equally. Those that are, the cutoff date really is the 1st of July 2019. If your SPC was filed and granted and enforced before that date, the waiver will not apply to these SPCs. If, however, both filing and entry into force take place after the 1st of July 2019, then it will apply without exception. However, if they are filed before the 1st of July 2019 and they enter into force after that date, they will fall under the SPC Manufacturing waiver as of the 2nd of July 2022. So this brings me to the end of my presentation. I will gladly give the floor to Kirian to explain how the SPCs have kept CGU very busy. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for providing what I think was a really clear overview of regulatory exclusivity rights. I will be discussing 3, let us say, rather specific topics, but topics which are definitely high on the agenda of the European institutions. And the first of that is supplementary protection certificates. And that has been keeping, in particular, the Court of Justice of the European Union busy in the last couple of years, in the last decades even, with 2 recent cases rendered in 2020, the Royalty Pharma case, the first, and the second, the Santen case. So let us discuss both cases. First case, Royalty Pharma. The background in Royalty Pharma was a basic patent, as Laura discussed before. Your SPC is granted on the basis of a basic patent that extends the protection term of that basic patent for the product under your marketing authorization. And the basic patent here covered the so-called dipeptidyl peptidase 4 inhibitors. So that's an enzyme inhibitor, and the patentee was Royalty Pharma. Now, one of these, or such a DP4 inhibitor, is sitagliptin. Sitagliptin was, at the time of the basic patent, not yet developed. So the basic patent disclosed this general class of compounds, but sitagliptin, a specific compound, was not yet developed at the time of the filing of the basic patent. Instead, the licensee of Royalty Pharma's patent, Merck Sharp & Dohme, developed sitagliptin later on and obtained a new patent for sitagliptin and a supplementary protection certificate for sitagliptin as well. Now, Royalty Pharma actually applied for its own supplementary protection certificate on the basis of its first patent. And that application was refused by the German Patent Office. So what happened? Proceedings started, and this ended up in the Court of Justice of the European Union with a question for preliminary ruling. The question here is condition under Article 3A, the condition for obtaining a supplementary protection certificate that actually relates to what has to be in your basic patent. And Article 3A, as you see on the slide, refers to the fact that the product, sitagliptin, has to be protected by a basic patent in force. The main question here has always been, what does it mean being protected by a basic patent in force? The background was at the time of the filing, the reference for preliminary ruling was the decision of Eli Lilly, of the Court of Justice, in the Eli Lilly case. And in that case, the Court of Justice actually clarified that it is not necessary that the active ingredient is identified, mentioned in the claims of the patent, or identified by means of a structural formula. No, it's also protected by that basic patent if your claim of your patent in a functional way covers that compound, particularly if the claim relates, and these were the wordings of the Court of Justice of the European Union, relates implicitly but necessarily and specifically to that product. And in that regard, it referred to Article 96 of the European Patent Convention. Article 96 is on the scope of protection of European patents. The question in Royalty Pharma was, or a couple of questions. First of all, should the product form part of the subject matter of protection defined by the claims, and should it thus be provided to the expert as a specific embodiment of that, for instance, functional formula? It also asked, is it insufficient then if the product, although satisfying a functional definition in the claims, is not indicated in an individualized form as a specific embodiment? And I see that there are two typos here, which we will correct in the circulated version. Or if it was developed only after the filing date of the basic patent as a result of an independent inventive step. In the meanwhile, while Royalty Pharma was actually pending with the Court of Justice of the European Union, the Teva versus Gilead decision was rendered by the Grand Chamber of the Court of Justice. And in that decision, the Court of Justice stated that to be implicitly, but necessarily and specifically relating to a product, that patent has to be, so the combination must necessarily, in view of the prior art and from the viewpoint of the skilled person, which is a technical term under patent law, the combination, because it was regarding a combination product, the combination must necessarily fall under the invention covered by that patent. And secondly, each of those active ingredients and that combination must be specifically identifiable in light of all the information disclosed by the patent. So you're looking at the patent, you're looking at the description, the drawings, as well as the prior art. You're looking at it from the viewpoint of the skilled person, and then you need to determine, first of all, does the product fall under the invention covered by that patent? And secondly, is it specifically identifiable in the patent? There's been some back and forth then, because the Court of Justice actually asked the Bundespatentgericht, the German court deciding on patent validity matters and SPC validity matters, do you actually want to maintain your question? Because actually, in the meanwhile, we already clarified Article 3A in our Grand Chamber's decision. And the Bundespatentgericht answered yes. We do want to get an answer, and particularly because we need to obtain uniformity at the level of SPCs. They are granted in the respective national patent offices, so there can be discrepancies. They are judged upon by the national courts. And what is lacking often in respect of supplementary protection certificates is exactly uniformity. Nonetheless, that was the purpose of establishing SPCs under the SPC regulation. A uniform practice, therefore, the Bundespatentgericht says, is key. And we need to know also whether the concept of a so-called core inventive advance is relevant for Article 3A. As a matter of background, the core inventive advance, what is actually the real core of your invention, at least that is what I would understand of it, because actually nobody particularly knows what this core inventive advance would mean. But such a core inventive advance, as you can see, is arguably more limited than what is subsequently disclosed and claimed in the claims of a basic patent, because they will build upon what is your core inventive advance. And it is definitely more limited than what the scope of protection is under Article 96 of the European Patent Convention of your patent. So if you would only look at the core inventive advance, if a product needs to be part of the core inventive advance of your patent, substantially less supplementary protection certificates would arguably be possible. And that is the relevance of this question. The Advocate General Hogan answered, well, he said Teva versus Gilead already explicitly or implicitly rejected the concept of a core inventive advance. And in any event, such a criterion, which would be regarding the inventive advance of the patent, would risk to give rise to confusion with the criteria of determining whether an invention is patentable. And whether an invention is patentable has already been subject of the examination of your patent application and the granting of your patent. So it has no purpose under the SPC regulation and in respect of supplementary protection certificates, which are regulatory rights building on both patents and marketing authorizations combined. So it said Article 3A, the Advocate General said, is not the same as the question whether that product is patentable. The protection is different from the patentability. The Court of Justice of the European Union also rejected any concept of a core inventive advance, now explicitly, and it stated Teva versus Gilead never used this concept, so it doesn't have any relevance. And instead, the Teva versus Gilead decision referred to the key role played by the claims. And as I explained before, the claims are often a bit broader than what is arguably your core inventive advance under your patent. So in so doing, the court clearly relied on the interpretation of Article 3A and the concept of which the core inventive advance is not relevant. The Court of Justice now explicitly stated this and has therefore solved, let us say, some discussion between legal scholars on the relevance of the core inventive advance under Article 3A. It still remains a discussion point under Article 3C of the SPC regulation. Additionally, the Court of Justice also discussed the fact whether it should be a specific embodiment. And it thereby referred to the fact to what Teva versus Gilead already stated. A specific embodiment as such is not required. It can also be or fall under a general functional definition if it necessarily comes within the scope of the invention covered by a patent and provided that it is specifically identifiable. It's not identified, it is identifiable by the skilled person in light of the information in the patent and his common general knowledge. Specifically identifiable, the Court of Justice here also in paragraphs 40 to 42 gave some further explanation and actually added, let us say, a different concept, which is that it needs to be, skilled person needs to be able to infer directly and unequivocally from the specification of that patent as filed. He needs to infer directly and unequivocally the product from the specification of that patent as filed. It is an additional term and it remains to be seen because it actually cross-refers to what is in Article 123 of the European Patent Convention. And it's part of the motivation, not of the operative part. So the relevance of this remark remains to be seen and what needs to be done with it. But definitely, probably giving rise to further discussion as well. And then there was the additional question. What if your product was perhaps falling under the scope of the invention or falling under the scope of the original basic patent, but was actually developed after your basic patent? Your basic patent at that point in time could therefore not envisage or target this specific product already. And the Court of Justice said that a product is not protected under Article 3A if it is developed after the filing date of the application of the basic patent following an independent inventive step. So this also refers to the inventive step analysis under the European Patent Convention, or seems to refer to that. And in case of the factual background that I discussed before, you can see that sitagliptin, as I said, was developed after that basic patent by Merck Sharp and Dohme, and was actually protected by a new patent. Because a new patent could have been obtained, you can also argue that there was an inventive step under that new patent, and therefore this product could not fall, in the wording of the Court of Justice of the European Union, could not comply with Article 3A. It was not protected under the original basic patent. That was the first case regarding Article 3A of the SPC regulation. Second case, the Santen case. The Santen case is related to a product which had first obtained a marketing authorization for cyclosporine in 1983, and then in 2015 an SPC was applied for in respect of cyclosporine for use in the treatment of keratitis, so a specific indication of this compound. And the basis for that SPC was a marketing authorization for Icrivis, a second product for the use of cyclosporine to treat severe keratitis in certain patients, and a European patent that was applied for on 10th of October 2005. Now, the French Patent Office in this case had rejected the request as well. Here we're not discussing Article 3A as one of the conditions for obtaining a certificate, but Article 3D. And Article 3D states that the marketing authorization on which you rely needs to be the first marketing authorization to place that product, cyclosporine, on the market as a medicinal product. In the Nuremberg case in 2012, the Court of Justice had stated, also in relation to Article 3D, that the mere existence of an earlier marketing authorization does not preclude the grant of an SPC, so you can obtain an SPC for a different application of the same product. Let's say cyclosporine, you're using it, a new MA, you have obtained a new MA to use cyclosporine for a different application. You can get an SPC provided that the application is within the limits of the protection conferred by the basic patent. So yes, you can obtain additional SPCs for new indications of earlier authorized products if this is protected, and that brings us back to Article 3A, if this is protected by the basic patent. The question here in the Santen case, there were a number of questions, and I'm not going to discuss them into detail, but what is relevant here is that all of these questions all started from the understanding, the principles set out by the Court of Justice in the Nuremberg case. Must the concept of a different application within the meaning of the judgment in Nuremberg? Does the expression within the limits of the protection conferred by the basic patent within the meaning of the judgment in Nuremberg? So the court relied on what the Court of Justice had already stated and asked for further clarifications on very, very specific points. But the Court of Justice decided to follow its own way, to deal with this case in its own manner. And it actually said, it reformulated the question, and it stated, well, we as the Court of Justice of the European Union, we can provide the referring court with all elements of interpretation which may be of assistance in educating in the case, even if it has limited its questions. In other words, we can go beyond what has been asked from us. And thus, the Court of Justice said, it is in this case necessary to examine whether Article 3A allows you to obtain an SPC for a new indication of an earlier authorized product. First MA, as I think was also part of the discussion of Laura's presentation, you get an MA for your product, you get an MA for a new indication of your product. Does this new marketing authorization for the specific indication of the product allow you to obtain an SPC under Article 3D? And the Court of Justice in this case, answered this question in a negative manner. The fact that I said that the questions referred to the Court of Justice started from the Nuremberg case was relevant because everybody at that point in time knew that the Court of Justice had actually allowed these types of MAs to be granted in its Nuremberg decision. And now, implicitly, in any event, rather explicitly, as we will see, step back from that interpretation. And it said such a marketing authorization cannot be considered as the first marketing authorization if it covers a new therapeutic application of an active ingredient, and that active ingredient has already been the subject of a marketing authorization for a different therapeutic application. It relied on the definition of product. It said product is not limited to a particular application. Product is limited to your active ingredient or your combination of active ingredient. There's no discrepancy for a particular application, and therefore there's no distinct product if your product is used, your earlier authorized product is used for a new therapeutic application. And the fact that the marketing authorization, this marketing authorization for cyclosporine, as we saw before, for cyclosporine for use in the treatment of keratitis, the fact that this marketing authorization is the first to fall under that European patent applied for on the 10th of October 2005, that is in our view relevant. Article 3D does not refer to the scope of protection of your basic patent. It only refers to that authorization and to that product. And there's no reference to any indication whatsoever. So the answer was, as I said before, contradicting the Nuremberg decision. And the Court of Justice in Santen explicitly acknowledged the Nuremberg premise must be disregarded. It can't be more clear that you can therefore no longer obtain supplementary protection certificates for products with new therapeutic indications if they had been authorized before already. That was it on the level of the Court of Justice of the European Union. I see that it's 2:12, so we have sufficient time, I think, to deal with the two remaining topics, including questions if you would have questions, which we will gladly answer at the end of the session. The European Commission's review of regulatory exclusivity rights. Well, in this case, there's a specific current revision going on medicines for children, pediatric, and rare diseases, orphan, as Laura discussed before. And there is also the general revision of the EU general pharmaceutical legislation. And both, there are presently going on there's presently a public consultation going on, and that is about to be concluded in the first quarter and the fourth quarter of 2022. But let us look into what has been published already and what the pharmaceutical sector could be expecting from the European Commission. I've included a link to the joint evaluation that has been published by the European Commission on Pediatric and Orphan Medicines. And a link as well to the executive summary. So when you receive the slides, you will be able to, the slide will guide you through the relevant pages on the European Commission's website. The key findings of the European Commission when it discussed and when it examined the protection mechanisms that are presently in place, as the ones specifically discussed by Laura before, on pediatrics and orphan medicines, these mechanisms, have they done their job? That was actually what the Commission wanted to know. And it's concluded, on the one hand, yes, they have fostered the development and availability of such medicines, medicines for patients with rare diseases and medicines for children. More patients have been treated or are treated in the meanwhile. The medicines have become much faster available than what was the case before. And also the practice of off-label prescription for these types of patients, meaning prescribing a drug for an indication that is actually not in the label of that drug, has decreased. In other words, there are more sufficient drugs that presently are able to deal with these rare diseases or to be given to children because of the studies that have been done for that purpose. On the other hand, it also said that there is insufficient development in the areas where the need for the medicines is actually the greatest. So the rarest diseases, to put it in a different perspective, have not been able to profit as much as other rare diseases. In other words, there has been more development, not unsurprisingly also in more profitable therapeutic areas, but that is definitely a concern, and a concern that the European Commission also wants to address. So the questions that it actually asked us for orphan medicines is the threshold that Laura discussed before, of fewer than 5 patients into 10,000 persons in the EU, the right tool for identifying rare diseases? Or should we go for a different tool? And also, how do we apply this to personalized medicines? Because if personalized medicines are developed and they are targeting specific persons, as personalized medicines do, then this threshold of 5 in 10,000, perhaps 1 in 10 million, wouldn't be able to deal with this case, because these drugs would all be considered as orphan medicines. Pediatric medicines, question there is the pediatric extension of the term of the SPC, one of the rewards that Laura also referred to, in addition to the extension of the orphan exclusivity, if it is an orphan drug, is that pediatric SPC extension the right main pediatric reward? It's the most important reward, but it is untargeted because it actually extends the protection of the SPC not only for the children, but also for the adults. Also, what about critical mass? Because pediatric extension becomes more valuable if your product is in adults and overall in any event is a very successful product. Whereas if it's a less successful product, although you've still done the job for the children, perhaps more children even with this particular product than with the very commercially successful product, but nonetheless your profits will not be, or the return will not be the same on investment. And finally, it's also rather complex. As we know, and as we've seen before, SPC supplementary protection certificates and pediatric extensions need to be applied for at a national level, at the various national patent offices. Further findings of the European Commission was also that the cost for healthcare systems was, of course, increased, but that this was compensated by the benefit for patients, and that a problem that was envisaged or that was seen was that orphan and pediatric medicines were not always equally accessible in all countries, although this had less to do with the specific rewards in terms of orphan and pediatric research, but more with focus of strategic focus, commercial focus on particular countries. And further inefficiencies and undesirable consequences in general manner, it stated, needed to be solved as well. Now, the options, let us see what has been discussed, which we know of unofficially mostly, but the options that have been discussed at the level and that are discussed at the level of the European Commission and with the relevant stakeholders are for orphan medicines. The first question is, should we increase the threshold? Should it be fewer than 5 out of 10,000 persons? Should that be limited? Or should we change to a different criterion or add an additional criterion? For instance, should we distinguish between an innovative drug and a repurposed drug? Should we focus on the return, actual return for the company rather than the patient? Because of course the patient and the cost and the price per product, the profit per product combined will give you the return, but the patients themselves will not do that already. The requirement, should there be a requirement of availability in all EU member states? Because we've seen that there is a discrepancy between the different member states in terms of availability. And a third alternative route is, should we replace the orphan exclusivity with or add another incentive? Perhaps it can be the main incentive, but there should be an additional one for very rare diseases. Should we increase, for instance, public funding in these types of and research for these types of diseases? Or should we create a transferable voucher for a fast-track review? That is the case in the US, where if you, cutting it brief or presenting it very briefly and shortly, if you get an orphan, if you research into an orphan medicine and that's successful, you can get a voucher for a fast-track review that you can then use for another successful, already successful, or a product that has a larger scope, a larger public targeted, targeted patient population. That is the correct wording. Or should we extend market exclusivity a bit further also for orphan drugs or orphan indications? For pediatric medicines, it's very similar. Should we also add an additional criterion here? For instance, that the PIP, the Pediatric Investigation Plan, the PIP, is timely completed? Or should there again be a requirement of availability in all EU member states? Also, should we replace with or add other incentives? For instance, should we rethink the Puma or the PUMA scheme that Laura referred to before? Should we rethink the Orphan Rewards, also connected with pediatric indications? Should we increase, again, public funding, transferable voucher, or extend market exclusivity? These are all things that are on the table, and a number of options have been combined already with each other in terms of different routes that can be followed. But as I said before, it will take a bit of time before this is concluded. And that brings me to 2:20, which gives me time. I think I only need about 2 to 3 minutes to discuss the Polpharma ruling, very recent Polpharma ruling of the 5th of May of the General Court. Now, the factual background here is an active ingredient that is DMF, dimethyl fumarate. Biogen had obtained an MA, actually it had been obtained by a different company, transferred eventually to Biogen for Fumadine. And Fumadine was a product on the basis of DMF together with MEF, monoethyl fumarate. And it was targeting the treatment of psoriasis. Now, Biogen applied for an additional marketing authorization for Tecfidera. And Tecfidera this time was a single active ingredient, only DMF, no MEF. It treated multiple sclerosis instead of psoriasis. And there was an extensive back and forth between Biogen and the European Medicines Agency, because at that point in time it was pretty new when a product had been in a combination or an active ingredient had been part of a medicinal product in a combination. And then the product, this active ingredient, was individually put on the market as a medicinal product. The question was, is there then a new medicinal product, a new active substance? Still, is this, or does this justify, in particular, the regulatory data protection and market protection that Laura was referring before? And therefore, there were a number of questions that went back and forth between Biogen and the European Medicines Agency. But the most important conclusion of this was that eventually the European Commission's implementing decision, the one of 30 January 2014, the implementing decision of the European Commission, that confirmed that Tecfidera and Fumadine do not belong to the same global marketing authorization. In other words, the marketing authorization for Tecfidera, the application thereof, and the clinical studies and so forth, grant regulatory data protection and market protection. Well, Polpharma nonetheless applied for a marketing authorization for a generic version of Tecfidera already in 2018. As you see, it was in 2014 that was the DMA was granted, so there was actually a regulatory data protection until 2022 and market protection until 2024. And Polpharma applied for its marketing authorization for a generic version of Tecfidera, and it argued, well, MEF and DMF are both active and they're not the same active. Well, no, the European the European Medicines Agency rejected Polpharma's application on the 30th of July 2018, and it stated that EMF and DMF are both active and they are not the same active substance. So DMF was not already on the market as an active substance individually. Tecfidera and Fumaderm do not belong to the same global marketing authorization, thereby referring to that implementing decision of the European Commission in 2014. The slide. And data protection for Tecfidera has therefore not yet expired. Therefore, we reject your application for generic marketing authorization. Polpharma requested the annulment of, well, actually it pleaded, it entered a plea, or it submitted a plea of illegality in respect of the Commission implementing decision of 30 January 2014. That was inadmissible according to the General Court, but it stated we can still examine this plea of illegality in respect of the annulment of the EMA's decision, and the one of 2018. And then the second part was indeed the annulment of the EMA's decision of 30 July 2018. Now, that request for annulment of the EMA's decision of 30 July 2018 was deemed to be admissible by the court. It rejected the arguments, and they are rather procedural, so I've included them on the slide, but will not discuss them further into, well, in the framework of the present presentation. But the request for annulment against EMA's decision was deemed admissible, and the contested decision of the European marketing authorization was eventually also annulled by the General Court. This can very well go to the Court of Justice of the European Union, but at this time it's the General Court that has annulled this decision. And it referred to the fact that the marketing authorization was based, well, the fact that this marketing authorization, Biogen's marketing authorization for Tecfidera, was based on a full application. That has no effect on the scope of the concept of a global marketing authorization. It's not because you're submitting clinical trials and so forth that you are able to obtain regulatory data protection. That's actually what they're saying. Instead, it needs to be assessed whether the lack of MEF, monoethyl fumarate, and Tecfidera was clinically relevant. Because if it's not, it's still actually a bit of the same product. So in other words, was MEF in Fumaderm, the first product under the first marketing authorization, did that have a significant therapeutic effect? And when judging the file, it held that neither the EMA nor the Commission assessed the role played by MEF within Fumaderm, which it considered to be relevant. Although it also acknowledged that at that point in time, all this was very new and therefore needed to be dealt with some improvisation, perhaps by the European Medicines Agency and the Commission. And finally, it held that the implementing decision of 30 January 2014 had a manifest error of assessment because it did not assess the role played by MEF. Therefore, it was inapplicable regarding the fact and defining that Tecfidera did not belong to the same global marketing authorization as Fumaderm. What it's saying in the General Court is, yes, it remains applicable in terms of your marketing authorization for Tecfidera has been granted. We're not kind of revoking that marketing authorization, but defining in the implementing decision that this is not part of the same global MA has now been deemed inapplicable. And as a result of that, the contested decision of the European Medicines Agency, which was based on the implementing decision, has annulled. And that is it for the presentation of today. Before addressing questions, I don't know, have there been questions, Laura? There haven't been questions yet. It's 2:28. Well, if there are still questions, don't hesitate, shoot through the chat, or if you want, of course, you can always send us an email after the session to ask further follow-up questions. We're here for you. We're also here for you in terms of further information that we will always publish on the one hand on our Altius Life and Health blog, which we've started a couple of years ago, and which comes with updates, I would say 1 to 2 times a month in terms of relevant legal developments in the life and health area. That means not only life sciences, but also agri-food sector. And the next session, that's also why I say stay tuned. The next session, Life Sciences session number 5, normally it's every 2 months. but that would mean mid of July. And given that we think that a lot of us will try to get some holidays, definitely after the past period, we've scheduled our next Life Sciences session on the 28th of September 2021, which will be on a very different topic, particularly the precautionary principle in the agri-food sector, which will be presented by our colleagues Philippe de Jong and Brecht Raus, who are the experts in the field of agri-food. Also, I've included the stay tuned button. You can always enter your name, just name, first name, email address, and then click on life and health or any other sectors that you would be interested in. Submit, and you will get our updates both on the blog and in terms of any further life sciences sessions. And then finally, I've looked again at Laura, but she confirms there are no questions, which means this was all very clear, for which we're very relieved, perhaps, and also grateful for your attention during this presentation. Thank you again, and enjoy a very nice rest of the week.